Hey, good to be with all you guys today. Happy Easter. You know, a long time ago, or just a few years ago, actually, there was I spoke at the sunrise service for the local Ukrainian church here in Philly, and they have a tradition at the very beginning that goes way back to the early church, where the speaker gets up, says, usually the pastor, "Christ is risen," and then the congregation says, "Christ is risen indeed," and they do that 3 times. So in the tradition of the early church, let's do that this morning. Christ is risen.
Christ is risen indeed.
Christ is risen.
Christ is risen indeed.
Christ is risen.
Christ is risen indeed.
Hallelujah.
Hallelujah.
You know, if there wasn't an Easter, then Good Friday was just another Friday, wasn't it? I'm so happy that Resurrection Day and Easter happened. It's good to be here. I really appreciate Chuck. We have now developed a friendship over the last several years, and I just love coming up to Philly. I was coming up and helping him out once every semester for several days. Now my calendar is just filling up so quickly. I think it's been a year or maybe a year and a half. Okay. So anyway, it's great to be with you guys again, and love coming to this church and seeing friends. And so it's good to be here. Just a little about my background. I'll be turning 50 this year. And I grew up in a Christian family, became a Christian at the age of 10. But I didn't grow in any kind of spiritual leaps and bounds. And then I went spiritually, and then I went to Liberty University and really started to grow there. I was in a strong Christian environment, and I was a music major. Toward the end of my bachelor's work, I just was reading the Bible so much and really wanted to get more in depth with it, so I learned Greek and went for a master's degree in New Testament. And toward the end of my master's degree, I was really starting to doubt my faith. How do I know it's true? And it was those questions that got me into the field that I do today, apologetics, and more specializing in New Testament studies and the historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. So not only have I written on it quite a bit, but I've also been in the ring with a lot of prominent skeptics, atheists, agnostics, Muslims. Have debated about 15 different times. Actually, since I've seen you last, I've been in South Africa. I've had 4 debates over there. I'm sorry, 2 debates, but I had 4 debates last year. And I'll be doing a couple debates back in South Africa again this year. They have a really interesting situation. They're kind of like where the church was back in the 1990s here. And liberalism is really growing rampant over there with a group called the New Reformation Movement, which is kind of the based on the Jesus Seminar over here, a radical group on the theological left. And it's really causing a lot of anxiety and divisions within the church. And so when we went over there last year and did debates and lectures, the church was they were just hungry. The ground was so dry, and it was just really exciting to see the kind of fruit that resulted. So the resurrection brings a lot of hope, and the fact that there is a lot of good historical evidence for it is encouraging to Christians and gives us a lot of confidence when we share our faith with others, because we can show that Christianity is true based on the resurrection of Jesus. I don't have time to go over a complete case for the resurrection with you this morning. If you're wanting more information on that, I've got several books that you can get in bookstores, or Amazon's probably the cheapest place to get them. Most recent one is The Resurrection of Jesus, a New Historiographical Approach. It's 718 pages. So you could do that to prop your door open and keep it open. Or if you have a piano that's kind of rocky, you can just kind of lift it. It serves pretty well for those purposes. But what I want to do this morning is just give you just a few little tidbits. One of the things I want to give you is the earliest evidence that we have for the resurrection of Jesus. Now, maybe you'd think that that would come from the Gospels, but actually it doesn't. It comes from the letters of Paul, and it actually predates the writings of Paul. So let me show you how it works. I'm going to give you a little timeline this morning, and we'll start with the crucifixion of Jesus. And most scholars believe that Jesus was crucified either in 30 or 33, with a slight majority opting for 30, April of 30. So we'll go with that one. It really doesn't matter one way or the other, but we'll say around 30. So then, a couple of years later, there's a guy named Paul, and he has this experience. He's a persecutor of the church. He's out arresting Christians and throwing them in prison and consenting to their executions for being Christians. And then he becomes one because he has this experience that he sincerely believes is the risen Jesus who appeared to him. Now, this is something that virtually all scholars who study the subject, even atheists, agree upon. So he has this experience he thinks is the risen Jesus. And this radically transforms his life from being a persecutor of the church to one of its most able defenders. Now, scholars, they don't really know when this experience happened, but most would say between 1 and 3 years, so let's call it 2 years. So if Jesus is crucified in the year 30, then that means Paul converted around the year 32. Now, 3 years later, Paul goes back up to Jerusalem to visit with some of the disciples. And how do we know this? Well, Paul wrote 13 letters that are attributed to him in the New Testament. And of these, scholars are virtually unanimous in saying that 7 of them Paul actually wrote. The other 6, they debate on those. I think he wrote all 13. But it's a matter of, they say 7 of them he absolutely wrote. And so, in order just to make my case as strong as I can, I'm only going to appeal to those 7 letters. And one of those letters is Galatians. And in Galatians chapter 2, Paul says that 3 years after his conversion, he went up to Jerusalem to meet with Peter, the lead apostle, for 15 days. And he also met Saul James, the brother of the Lord. Now, that's 3 years later. So, remember, crucifixion is here at 30. And then you have Paul's conversion in 32. And then 3 years later, verse 35. Now, it's interesting to note that the Greek word that Paul uses here for visit or meet with is hysteresis. What English term do you think we get from that? History. See, Paul goes up to Jerusalem to get a history, basically. He inquires of Peter, who had known Jesus, and he wants to get a history. He wants to know what Jesus taught and what he said. What was he like? All this kind of stuff, because Paul had not been a disciple of Jesus. So he wanted to get the whole 9 yards from one who had been. Now that's 3 years later. So we're at 35. In Galatians chapter 2, Paul says that 14 years later, he goes back up to Jerusalem. Now, just the way Paul says this in Greek, we don't know if it's 14 years after this first visit or after his conversion. So we have to look at basically 16 to 19 years, somewhere around that, after Jesus' crucifixion. So that puts us at 46 to 49 AD. Somewhere either 46 or 49 AD. And so Paul goes back up there and he visits with Peter and James and John, the pillars of the church. So it's with Peter and James for a second time, and now add John to that. They're the 3 leaders of the church. Now, can you imagine being in a room with Peter, James, John, and Paul, the Fab Four? Wow. Wouldn't that be cool? Imagine if you had some theological questions, you sit down and talk with these guys and tell us, what was it like and what do you know? Just let us pick your brain for the next 5 years or something. Wouldn't that be great? Well, that's what Paul's doing. He's running the gospel past them, the message he'd been preaching. He's running that past Peter, James, and John. And he says he did that to make sure that he hadn't been working in vain all these years. So he wants to make sure he's getting his message right. Now, what's interesting is he responds, they added nothing to what I've been preaching. They extended the right hand of fellowship. In other words, they're saying, you're good, Paul. Keep up the good work, brother. So here it is, 16 to 19 years after Jesus' crucifixion, that Paul goes right back up. He's running the message that he's been preaching all these years. And the disciples certify that what he is preaching is in alignment with what they're preaching. So that tells us when we're reading Paul's letters, we can be confident that what he's saying is in alignment with the Jerusalem apostles.